Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the California Budget and Policy Center's first Empower event of 2022, Understanding the Governor's Proposed State Budget. I'm Scott Graves, the Budget Center's Director of Research, and I'll be moderating today's event. The full title of our series is Empower, People, Policy, Progress. This title reflects our efforts to empower you with the information that you need to advance smart policy choices and public investments. Empower is a free public education resource that is made possible by today's event sponsors: Blue Shield of California Foundation, Economic Security Project, Heising Simons Foundation, and the James Irvine Foundation. And also by viewers like you. You can donate to our programs by going to our website at calbudgetcenter.org. Since we only have an hour for today's event, we won't be taking a comprehensive look at the governor's proposals. Instead, we'll focus on four key issue areas: health, housing and homelessness, economic security, and education. For details on how other issue areas fared in the governor's proposed budget, check out our First Look publication, which we released last week and is available on our website. Our speakers today reflect a subset of the expertise on the Budget Center team. We're joined by Monica Davalos, policy analyst, who conducts research on the intersection of housing, health, and the justice system. Essie Hutchful, also a policy analyst, who focuses on how the social safety net serves Californians, particularly through cash assistance. Ariel Mesquita, also one of our policy analysts, who studies housing policies, tenant protections, and measures to increase housing affordability. And finally, Eric Saucedo, our state policy fellow, who focuses on research around improving education systems. After their presentations, I'll moderate a live Q&A session with our speakers to answer your questions. So please put your questions in the comments section at any time, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. To get us started this afternoon, I wanted to very briefly make three big picture points about the governor's proposed budget to help set the stage for the presentations to come. The first point is that the governor's proposed budget is really just that, a proposal. The spending plan that Governor Newsom released last week reflects the governor's vision for California. Everything in that plan is just a starting point for further discussions. The governor's views, of course, carry a lot of weight, but they're not the end of the story. The legislature's budget committees have already begun digging into the governor's proposals and will continue to hold many public hearings in the weeks ahead. These budget hearings provide an opportunity for legislators as well as for advocates to comment on the governor's proposals and advance their own ideas about what the budget should look like in the upcoming fiscal year. Beyond these budget hearings, Governor Newsom will unveil a revised budget proposal in mid-May, after which the process will move at warp speed as state policymakers, particularly the governor and the legislative leaders, work to finalize the outcomes of the budget package, or the outlines of the budget package in June. A lot can and will change between now and June. Let me repeat that. A lot can and will change. Your voice matters, and there will be many opportunities to push your values and priorities to be reflected in our state's spending plan for the fiscal year that begins on July 1st. This brings me to my second key point. The governor's proposal includes many major advances, but there is definitely more work to do. The governor's proposals make significant progress towards supporting the health and economic well-being of Californians, particularly Californians with low incomes, people of color, immigrants, and women. But the governor's proposals are not a complete response to what is needed right now, especially given the devastating impacts of the pandemic on families and individuals across the state. In other words, there are gaps in the governor's budget proposals. these gaps create opportunities for legislators and advocates to push for urgent and ongoing investments as part of this year's spending plan, particularly to support the people who have put their own health and well-being at risk in order to keep our communities running. I think it's fair to say that there's good reason for optimism about the budget this year, but there's also a strong cause for concern. And this brings me to my third and final point, which is the biggest unknown in this year's state budget is the GAN limit. The GAN limit is a spending cap that was put into the state constitution by voters back in 1979 at the close of the disco era. This restrictive spending cap is intended to impose the budget priorities of the late 1970s on all future generations of Californians, including the nearly 40 million of us who call California home today. But it's important to understand that not all spending is created equal in the eyes of the GAN limit. For example, the state is allowed to spend unlimited amounts on things like infrastructure and debt service, which aren't subject to the GAN limit. In contrast, the GAN limit severely restricts our ability to prioritize ongoing people-focused investments that are needed to help all Californians be healthy and thrive. Governor Newsom has already signaled that the GAN limit will be a major issue in the state budget this year. So all eyes are on the May revision, where the governor will outline the scope of the problem and proposals to address it, with the understanding that any outcome on the GAN limit will reflect a compromise between the governor's administration and legislative leaders. So with that overview and context, I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Aureo Mesquita, who will walk us through some key health policy issues in the governor's proposed budget.
All right, thank you, Scott. So today I want to highlight key proposals in the governor's budget that help reduce health inequities in our systems, that provide millions of Californians with access to health care, including physical health and behavioral health. But before I do that, I want to just take a minute to ground ourselves in the current moment. We've seen a recent surge in cases and hospitalizations due to COVID-19. COVID-19 that has had a devastating impact on the health and well-being of our children and families, and especially on communities of color that have seen higher rates of illness and death. And this is no accident. This is due to historic and ongoing structural racism, right? Like systems that have been designed to keep people from accessing the care that they need and that continue to deny people access to opportunities to live healthy lives and to thrive. In addition, due to chronic underfunding in public health, our counties and cities were not adequately prepared to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that background, today I want to highlight a few key proposals that tackle some of these issues and that help advance health equity in California. The first is that the governor has proposed to eliminate the racist and xenophobic exclusion of undocumented immigrants from Medi-Cal. So policy choices that were rooted in anti-immigrant sentiments of the 1990s have systematically excluded undocumented immigrants from access to Medi-Cal, as well as to other programs like food assistance and cash supports. However, California has made progress on this front. Over the past few years, California has eliminated this exclusion for undocumented children and young adults up to age 25. And starting in May of this year, adults ages 50 and over will have access to Medi-Cal. So these have been important advances. And this year, the governor is proposing to eliminate that exclusion for the remaining group, ages 26 to 49. And this is a significant investment. This means California is the first state to offer comprehensive Medi-Cal to all its residents, regardless of immigration status. But just one important caveat for us to note: this is not an immediate action. The governor is proposing that this start January 1st of 2024. And so, as we said earlier, the pandemic is ongoing now, and we need to make sure that all Californians receive the access to healthcare that they need now as well. The governor also announced plans to move forward with implementing CalAIM. And so CalAIM stands for California Advancing and Innovating Medi-Cal. This reform is to better coordinate between our different systems. So between physical health, behavioral health, and social services, really to help Californians navigate the complexities of these different systems. So this will be a significant change to Medi-Cal, a significant reform. And encourage you to take a look at our first look summary for more details, as well as costs for this program change. In addition, the governor's budget proposal includes funding for the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative. This aims to transform California's behavioral health system and ensure that all children in California are routinely checked, screened, and supported for their needs. And lastly, just one final important investment in health. In direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the governor has proposed $2.7 billion to improve the state's testing capacity, increase vaccination uptake, as well as support our healthcare system and frontline workers. And of this funding, he's requested that the legislature move $1.4 billion in an early action package before the June budget. So these are important proposals that advance health equity in California, and state leaders can do more. One place they can start is by declaring racism a public health crisis at the state level, and they can also work to establish dedicated funding to better support community-based organizations, clinics, and tribal organizations in their efforts to advance health equity. So with that, I would encourage you to take a look at our first look analysis for more details on the health proposals, as well as for other items that you'll hear today and for other items in the governor's budget. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, policy analyst Monica Davalos, who will go over governor's proposal for housing and homelessness.
Yeah, thanks, Audio. So today I actually wanted to start off with a reminder that housing affordability and homelessness are directly tied, and racial inequities are deeply embedded in both. We know that government-supported discrimination and displacement on the basis of race is deeply ingrained in the United States and California history, and has really resulted in inequitable housing, employment, education, and other related policies that impact individuals' ability to really have stable and adequate housing. And today we really see these ramifications of these past and current practices as Black, American Indian, and Pacific Islander Californians are disproportionately likely to experience homelessness. We also see this as renters, people with low incomes, Black and Latinx Californians, and Californians who are undocumented are also especially likely to pay unaffordable housing costs that ultimately impacts their financial stability. And fundamentally, addressing the housing and homelessness issues the state is currently facing is crucial, as everyone needs a home to have access to basic life-sustaining resources and ultimately have the opportunity to live a dignified and healthy life. But with that, this year's budget, within this year's budget proposal, we did see some significant investments for both housing and homelessness. In terms of homelessness, this year, the governor proposed an additional $2 billion in new homelessness funds, which is on top of the funds that were previously allocated as part of last year's two-year package. The funds this year, though, primarily focus on short-term housing solutions, specifically for individuals experiencing homelessness who also have serious behavioral health conditions, and as well as for encampments or clearing of encampments. And while some short-term housing is needed within the homelessness services system to respond to urgent housing needs, focus should really remain on the fact that the most effective approach to solving homelessness among individuals with serious behavioral health conditions is a combination of both supportive services with permanent housing, which short-term housing may not necessarily address or be the most effective to do so. More details are also needed about how local jurisdictions can actually use the money they will be receiving to clear encampments. And because this is really important, since these efforts will be led by localities, they may have more discretion, and it's important to ensure that what they're doing will both effectively and respectfully address the housing and supportive service needs of Californians who are living in encampments, rather than just focusing on, cleaning up the streets. And the governor's budget proposal did also make some significant strides in really acknowledging and connecting homelessness with both behavioral health and physical health. For example, new funding for CalAIM, which is the state effort to reform Medi-Cal. Two new funding proposals really focus on justice-involved populations, as they are more likely to experience homelessness upon their release. And this includes connecting adults leaving incarceration with Medi-Cal healthcare coverage and behavioral health services prior to their release to really try to reduce the risk of poor health outcomes and, in extreme cases, homelessness. And there was also the proposal to coordinate healthcare with behavioral health and social services for Medi-Cal participants. And in the realm of housing, we also saw some significant investments here. This year, the governor proposed $1.5 billion one-time general funds to boost funding for several existing programs that support affordable housing development and preservation, with a focus on infill, which is pretty much just filling in typically denser communities to really try to address and reach its climate and equity goals. And there was also an additional $500 million for low-income housing tax credits, which continues the annual boost to the credit allocation for the fourth year running, which was really significant to see. And lastly, the governor followed up on one of his commitments from last year's budget and proposed $750 million one-time for public colleges and universities to develop or acquire more housing for students with low incomes. And while these are significant investments that are aimed and will help address the housing crisis in California, there are two key considerations that were missed. The first being is that there's still a need for long-term investments at scale to expand the current supply of affordable housing. And as I mentioned, most of the funding this year is solely one time. And in addressing the GAN limit constraints at the May revise, as Scott previously mentioned, one option is for the governor to actually boost infrastructure spending more so than what was already proposed, as infrastructure spending is one of the few types of expenditures that is exempt from the limit, and affordable housing counts as infrastructure. And the second missed opportunity is the fact that the budget did not include any funding for emergency rental assistance, despite the fact that requests from both renters or their landlords for California's COVID-19 emergency rental assistance program now total more than the $5.2 billion that the state received from the federal government. And with that, I'll now pass it over to Essie Hutchful to talk about economic security and workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So as Monica mentioned, I'm going to cover economic security proposals in the governor's budget. First, I want to just get us started by noting that our economic and social policies have long been clear examples of how racism, sexism, and xenophobia create unequal experiences in our economy, and also dictate who is considered as deserving of public supports. So that being said, how do Governor Newsom's proposals address these inequities or fail to do so? Again, this is going to be not going to be comprehensive. I'm just kind of offering the highlights. So the first sort of bright spot is in the area of tax credits. First, starting with the Young Child Tax Credit, which provides up to $1,000 annually to help families with low incomes and young children pay for basic needs. Currently, eligibility is tied to work, and that's a long-standing racist and sexist restriction that is often placed on public supports. The governor proposes ending this work requirement, and we want to sort of applaud that because it's in recognition of the fact that young children who live in households with no earned income are just as deserving of being protected from poverty as are children living in households that have low incomes. And that's a proposal that's projected to cost $55 million annually. There's also a new foster youth credit that I want to highlight. That would be a new refundable tax credit targeted towards former foster youth, and it's modeled after the Young Child Tax Credit that I just spoke about. This is for transition age foster youth who are ages 18 to 25, and that's because they experience high rates of poverty due to high unemployment and low annual earnings. And refundable tax credits like this one can be an important tool for helping boost incomes, helping them maintain housing, and pay for basic needs like food. So that's sort of the highlights of what we think is really a bright spot. And then there's a category that's sort of, I'd like to categorize as kind of mixed, a bit half in, half out. In the food assistance area, we saw in the 2021-22 budget agreement that began the process of expanding food assistance through the California Food Access Program to undocumented Californians who have thus far been excluded from food assistance programs due to these anti-immigrant xenophobic restrictions. The governor's proposal currently focuses on beginning that expansion to undocumented Californians who are age 55 or older. Now, this is a promising start, but considering our strong state revenues and that food assistance really addresses a fundamental basic need, we really want to highlight the need to move beyond just targeted implementation to include all Californians who face hunger. Another sort of so-so advancement is in the area of CalWORKs, where there are grant increases, but those proposed increases are, one, reflect prior legislation, and ultimately also do not change the fact that maximum grants remain below the deep poverty threshold for children living with an unaided family member. So in other words, in over half of all CalWORKs cases, the maximum grant still keeps children below 50% of the federal poverty line. And it should be obvious, but it's well past time for the state to commit to ensuring that no child in the CalWORKs program is living in poverty, never mind deep poverty. And now there's the category of what we can, fairly describe as just full-on misses, not even so-so. In the area of childcare, I want to highlight that the budget proposal does not take any action to continue to increase payment rates for childcare providers, who we all know have really stepped up big time during this pandemic to provide vital care for kids that has kept our economy going. And it's true that last year's budget agreement did include a long overdue increase in payments, but the rates that increase was based on, those rates were outdated well before the governor even signed the bill. So state leaders really have to do a lot more to support these providers who are continuing to offer care at great personal risk. We know that our communities and our kids can only thrive when our childcare providers are thriving too, and frankly, that's just fundamental. Lastly, I'd like to end by highlighting the area of paid leave, where the proposal also fails to increase benefits for our state's paid family leave program. And that means that many workers, particularly workers with low wages, who are disproportionately women and people of color, these workers are unable to take time off to care for their family. The proposal also didn't reinstate COVID supplemental sick leave, which lapsed last fall, even though, as we all know, here in 2022, the pandemic and its many Greek letter surges certainly have not lapsed and left us behind. Without this supplemental paid sick leave, many workers, again, disproportionately workers with low wages, they only have 3 days of paid sick leave per year. Without paid time off, they either have to choose to go into work sick, jeopardizing their health and the health of their peers, or to stay home and miss out on their paycheck. So overall, I'm going to just end by saying that we see some promising investments for sure in economic security, but there are some clear areas where we just can't really rest on our laurels and we have to do a lot better. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to my colleague, Eric, who's going to go over education for us.
Thank you, Essie. I'll be closing this portion of our Empower event by sharing a little bit more about how this budget approaches the needs of California students. We know that despite improvements in education funding, the state has made little progress in closing opportunity gaps for English learners, students of color, and students from low-income families. And recently, the pandemic raised even more barriers for students already barred from opportunity. And it also increased the need to invest in removing those barriers so that California students and families can achieve their educational goals. So now let's look at what this budget does to remove some of those barriers. The budget proposal includes several education investments to highlight. First, it includes an increase in funding for the expansion of the state's expanded learning programs, which provide additional hours of learning outside the regular school day, including summer. This investment comes in recognition that students and families are already utilizing and expecting more tutoring and more enrichment activities, especially after almost 2 years of disruptions to learning caused by the COVID-19. Something that's really important to highlight in this investment is that it prioritizes English learners, foster youth, and students from low-income families. And to illustrate the magnitude of this investment, this program in 2021-22 received $1 billion. And under this proposal in 2022-23, it would receive another $3.4 billion with additional funds, with additional dollars to help schools integrate music and arts into their program options. I think it's important to note that one of the challenges at this stage of implementation of these programs is that districts are struggling to attract people to staff the programs. And that's in addition to other challenges that come from the impacts of the ongoing pandemic on entire communities. Another investment is the continued implementation of Universal Transitional Kindergarten, or TK, which is a 2-year kindergarten program that will be offered to all 4-year-olds in the state, regardless of income. And in theory, it would increase opportunities for families to access early learning programs. This proposal includes funds to expand TK to younger children and also to reduce the student-to-teacher ratios by adding more staff to those TK classrooms. One quick note about the staffing ratios is to note that this proposal doesn't really go far enough. Hiring additional staff will certainly improve ratios and closely align those with other preschool programs with higher standards. But still, those ratios do not align with high-quality benchmarks. Now, in terms of higher education, we also know that there's a lot of work to do to ensure that students with low incomes and students of color have clear and viable pathways to a degree. And to that end, the administration is proposing multi-year investments in higher education to support agreements with California state universities and the University of California, and also a roadmap with the California community colleges that aim to improve student outcomes, increase affordability, close equity gaps, increase access, improve alignment with workforce needs, and overall strengthen collaboration among all those systems. It's still unclear what sort of accountability measures will be put in place to ensure that the UCs and the CSUs meet those expectations and goals. And it's also important to note that these type of agreements have fallen short in meeting goals during previous administrations. So it's critical that those concerns are addressed in the next few months. Lastly, although there's some progress in expanding access in higher education, the budget falls short in addressing the issue of college affordability, and specifically student aid. Just a few months ago, the administration rejected a full reform of the Cal Grant program, which is the state's financial aid program. Such reform would have eliminated additional barriers to financial aid, but the administration cited that it would be too costly. Yet, we know that many students with low incomes and students of color had to hit pause on their educational plans due to financial stressors. And that's especially true for students at the community colleges. This is a clear missed opportunity to provide more direct aid to students to support them with the high cost of housing, food, childcare, and other needs. And overall, the proposals are steps in the right direction, but there's still work to be done to fully transform public education so that all students can succeed. I also wanted to note that there's a lot more in education that we can talk about, as in other areas my colleagues already mentioned, and you can read more on our website at calbudgetcenter.org. Now, I'll hand it back to Scott for a Q&A session.
Thank you, Eric. I wanted to thank all of my colleagues, Audio, Monica, Essie, and Eric, for those excellent presentations. I would like to now transition us to the Q&A portion of today's event. For the first question, I wanted to open it up a bit and give my colleagues an opportunity to go somewhat beyond the 4 issue areas that we just covered. And my question here to all of you is, are there other items or missed opportunities in the governor's proposals that have significant equity implications and that you would like to raise up here?
Yeah, Scott. So what? Oh, there we go. So one proposal that we haven't mentioned yet is that the governor is proposing to spend $3 billion in general fund to pay down unemployment insurance debt. That really is the responsibility of corporations and businesses. This isn't an unnecessary move at this moment. During the pandemic, millions of Californians turned to unemployment insurance benefits that were crucial, right, for helping people pay for basic needs, for food, for housing. But to pay for these benefits, California actually had to borrow billions of dollars from the federal government. And the reason California had to do that is because unemployment benefits are financed through payroll taxes that businesses have to pay to the state. But businesses haven't been paying the true cost of these benefits for their workers for decades now. And so California, this accumulation, caused California to have to borrow this money. So the governor is proposing to spend $3 billion in general fund to pay back some of the money that was borrowed. And I won't go into the details. You can take a look at our first look analysis for the details of this, how the agreement has been reached. But most importantly, the takeaway here is that this is $3 billion that is being wasted at the moment that could be better used to support Californians who need support paying for basic expenses, for food, for rent. So we just want to highlight that it's $3 billion that could be better used in other programs. So I'll open it back up to anyone else.
Yeah, and I can also chime in if that's all right. I would say it was also rather concerning to see the governor's cracking down on crime of retail and other crimes that he proposed in the budget this year. And there there was no explicit consideration for the potential equity concerns that come out of a lot of these tough on crime policies, as we've historically seen and really currently see. And it's important to note that since about the 2010s, California has passed various justice system related reforms, including Prop 47, that have actually led to sustained decreases in overall crime and prison population rates throughout the state. And focus, should really be placed more on on improving the steps that we have already taken, and also continuing to reduce the state's already bloated prison population, as racial disparities are still rampant there. And even better, going a step further would to place more emphasis in addressing some of the ramifications and the needs that people who are more likely to be justice involved face. So it was concerning to see that. And I'll pass it over back to Scott.
I'll go ahead and add to that question as well, Scott. In my presentation, I talked a lot about how some of the programs prioritize English learners, but we believe that supporting English learners is still a missed opportunity in this budget. The governor advanced several proposals, major proposals, such as community schools, expanded learning, as I mentioned earlier, and transitional kindergarten. And those programs are great, and they're needed. But we haven't seen the same commitment to improving education for English learners or prioritizing bilingual education, given that 40% of California K through 12 students live in a home where a language other than English is spoken. And not to say that there's nothing in the budget, the governor does include an investment of $200 million for multilingual libraries. Yet, the administration lacks a bold proposal, a bold policy agenda that would leverage multilingual students' assets and also build on their skills. Back to you, Scott.
Great, thank you for those responses. I wanted to now shift gears a little for our next question and come back around to what is my favorite topic these days, the GAN limit, which, as I noted earlier, is a restrictive, outdated spending cap approved by voters back in the late 1970s. We continue to get a lot of questions about the GAN limit and its implications for California. It can also be, as we all know at the Budget Center, very technical and abstract. How can we help to make this more concrete for advocates who are seeking ongoing investments for services through the state budget for this year and in years to come, and are wondering if the GAN limit might affect their budget asks, as they're called here in Sacramento? So anyone willing to take that one on?
Yeah, Scott, I'll take that one. In part because I can definitely relate to folks who are a bit confused about the GAN limit and why it matters to them. Certainly myself in the beginning, I got a bit lost in the details. It can get kind of technical and wonky, but it is very important that we can try to sort of get past these sort of technical abstractions to focus fundamentally on how this affects our communities. So what I want to stress, if you kind of understand nothing else about this GAN limit, the spending cap, please understand that what it does is it restricts state spending on really critical supports. So think of things like childcare or in-home care for seniors or assistance with housing costs. These are public supports and services that are critical to shoring up our communities. And the cost of these public services can easily increase faster than the spending cap is allowed to rise each year. So that's where that restriction sort of comes into play. So to stress this, the GAN limit is important because it doesn't prioritize these kinds of people-focused investments that we care about. It implicitly views these investments as excessive or unnecessary. And of course, we know that that's not true. So anybody who is, an advocate who's focused on people's health, housing, economic security, the crises that face our state today, and who's able to see how investments in these spaces, is really critical for the future, you really need to be focused on the spending cap and how it sort of hamstrings us from responding to the needs, the problems that are facing our state. So that's sort of the high level overview of why the GAN limit and the spending cap matters. If you're more interested in the details, great, more power to you. You can visit our website. We have written a lot about that, and we'll continue to do so. But that's just the basics, and I hope that helps clear things up for folks.
That was very persuasive, Essie. You had convinced me that the GAN limit may not be the best thing for the state of California in the year 2022. Anyone else want to get in on this? If you really want to jump in on the GAN limit, this is your opportunity. I'm sure we'll have more opportunities in the near future, but it's now or never for this webinar.
Sure, Scott. I just wanted to add one comment about the design of this law, the GAN limit, and the equity implications that come with it. In the likely event that the state goes over the GAN limit and it triggers allocations to K through 14 schools and colleges, those allocations, again, to the extent that they occur, would not be allocated equitably because they would go out to schools and colleges on a per student basis rather than going out through the state's funding formula, which is an equity-based formula that factors in the number of students who are English learners, foster youth, or students with low income families. So that's just another issue there with how this law is designed and some of the implications that come with it if we don't solve it in the next we don't take care of it in the next few months, years, whenever that happens.
Thank you, Eric. One of the other technical aspects of the GAN limit that's really important to keep in mind. So thanks for letting us have a better understanding of that particular issue. I wanted to switch gears here. I think this next question from the audience is probably going to be directed to you, Ario, so get ready. We received a question about if we know whether expanding Medi-Cal to adults ages 26 to 49, regardless of immigration status, might create any kind of public charge concerns for these folks if the governor's proposal does become law. This group becomes eligible for coverage and they go ahead and sign up. So it's a question about concerns over whether there might be some negative repercussions to folks who become eligible for coverage and then find that something is down the road is happening that they would rather not have happen. So can you shed some light on that one?
I'm sure. So the short answer is no. It is not a public charge issue. Public charge is grounds for inadmissibility, which means if there are reasons for why somebody would be denied a green card or a visa or entry into the country. And so the answer is no. Someone accessing Medi-Cal in California will not be penalized in public charge later on. This is also important for other programs as well, not just Medi-Cal, but other programs that California have expanded and allowed undocumented immigrants to access. I think there's an issue of potentially increasing state funding for outreach, making sure that communities and that our neighbors and understand that this is not an issue and that people really should be accessing these programs that are now available to them. And so I think there is no issue. There could be a perceived issue from folks, but I think to combat that, state funding for outreach and education programs is important. And just noting, California has already expanded to children, so children and young adults up to age 20, up to 25, already do have access right now to Medi-Cal. So we want to make sure that everyone who is eligible can access and knows that they can have access to that. So hopefully that answers that question.
Great, thank you, Audio, for laying out the facts on that one so clearly. It's such an important policy change. We do have another audience question here. I think this one is I'm going to direct to my colleague Essie Hutchful. The question is about outreach efforts to ensure that the child tax credit is reaching families and so that people know they're eligible. Essie, do you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because of course you can provide these credits, but people need to be able to access them. So for whoever it is who asked that question, I highly recommend that you get in touch with our colleague Alyssa Anderson. She leads that issue for us. She's absolutely brilliant and can help you with the details of this. What we can say here is that the budget includes a little over 5 million with an M. That's proposed to support outreach and implementation. But if you're interested more in the specifics on what that outreach looks like and who is leading that, definitely recommend you reach out to Alyssa, who will be able to help you further with that. She's great to talk to. And we're going to have contact information at the end of the presentation, but you can also just reach out to anyone on our team via our website's team page. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Essie. That was very clear. Appreciate that update. I'm going to go to my colleague Eric. Turn that back to the education space here. We have a question about the troubling trend in student enrollment, dropping. The question is, we know the pandemic has accelerated a projected decline in student enrollment, and it's also been increasing rates of absenteeism. Do we know how the governor is proposing to address this issue?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, in the proposal, the main focus of the administration is to prevent school districts from losing any dollars, given that the state's main funding formula uses attendance, which is known as average daily attendance, to allocate dollars to districts. And just a little bit of like technical background there. Under the current law, districts use average daily attendance from the current year or the prior year, whichever is higher, to generate funding. And under the proposal, it would give districts another option, which is to use an average of the previous 3 years of average daily attendance. So now they would have another option other than the current year and the prior year, and whichever is higher of those, they would be able to use that average daily attendance. I mean, one important thing to note is that there may be other proposals that differ from what the governor is proposing, but what we want to make sure that we mention is that any proposals or any changes to the formula need to ensure that districts that serve higher concentrations or higher percentages of students from low-income families, English learners, and foster youth do not lose any funding as a result of such change.
Great, thank you, Eric, for that explanation. We had a question come in from the audience. Monica, I think this one's going to be for you. The question is, when might we see clarity on how local governments can use what I guess is being called homelessness encampment money, and how can local groups ensure that it's being used justly or equitably at the local level?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the thing to remember right now that this is just proposed funding. So whatever is in the governor's budget, and if it doesn't get modified in some way by the legislature, it doesn't take this funding specifically, I believe it won't take effect until the next fiscal year. But right now, more than ever, it's really important to get in touch both with your state level representatives as well as local representatives to really emphasize and explain to what your community needs, and really address with your local representatives on their approaches to resolving, homelessness encampments and how to really do it in a people-focused and humane way. That's also evidence-based rather than just creating future displacement. And I hope that answers that.
That's great. Thank you, Monica. We have also received an audience question related to proposals for folks receiving SSI SSP, which is an acronym. Not many people know what that means, but it relates to cash assistance for seniors and people with disabilities who have low incomes. As the moderator, I typically wouldn't answer a question, but since I cover this issue for the Budget Center, I will just chime in to say that the governor does not have a proposal for the upcoming budget year related to increasing cash assistance for seniors and people with disabilities who are receiving SSI SSP. The issue here is that back during the Great Recession, so we're talking a decade ago or more, the state made some very deep cuts to this monthly cash assistance for some very low-income Californians and left those cuts in place for many, many years. Just last year, as part of the Budget Act, the legislature and governor decided to provide a substantial increase to the state's SSP portion of the grant, almost a 25% increase. So that was a substantial bump that took effect for recipients just this month, January 1st. But that only gets us so far, right? We saw deep cuts a decade ago, really left a lot of individuals, even receiving the maximum grant, still living in poverty, really unable to make ends meet. So advocates were hoping to see from the governor another proposal to increase grants again in the coming year. That's not there. Instead, what the governor has done is said, hey, as part of last year's budget agreement, in addition to boosting those grants by about 25%, we, meaning the governor and the legislature, agreed to another grant increase a couple years down the road. So it was kind of a commitment that was made with only on paper, basically. It has to be followed through on. So the governor is saying, I'm going to follow through on that commitment, and let's provide another grant increase for SSI SSP recipients 2 years from now, right? So starting in January 2024. So that's a long time to wait, particularly for folks who are still living in poverty, even when they receive the maximum grant. And even if the state were to provide that additional bump, so let's say another 25% increase to their grants, once you adjust everything for inflation from 10 years ago, these individuals will still be well below the poverty line relative to where they would have been if the grant had kept up with the cost of living in California. So bottom line, no increase proposed by the governor to SSI SSP grants this year, but an agreement to follow through on a commitment that was made as part of this year's budget package. So I'm going to shift gears here and see, I believe we have another question coming in. Okay, so we've actually been apparently receiving several questions related to mental health, behavioral health issues generally. We recommend that you get in touch with our colleague, Adriana Ramos Yamamoto, who is our lead on those issues and obviously isn't on this webinar today, but we're very easy to get in touch with at the Budget Center. Our profiles are on the website, so it's very easy to look up Adriana and she'll be happy to get back to you in a timely manner. So it looks like also we are running short on time now that I'm looking at the clock and realizing we need to close down in a few minutes. So I wanted to do a final quick go round with the team here as we draw to a close. The question is, team, what is the proposal that you will be watching most closely this budget season? I'll allow you to jump in as you're ready. The proposal that you will be watching most closely over the next several months as we move toward a final budget agreement in June. Don't make me call on you.
I'll jump in here. There are significant proposed reforms to Medi-Cal, so we'll be watching implementation of CalAIM, and also keeping an eye on expanding healthcare coverage to all California residents, regardless of immigration status. So we'll keep an eye on that next couple months.
I'll go next. So these are the things that I'm going to be looking for. Are, the proposals weren't in the proposed budget, so hopefully come May revision something will be there, and that's to see if there's, again, really going to be a real commitment in moving forward in the CalWork space to actually commit to ending child poverty, and then cheating, but Ario also did it. He did more than one. So I'm going to also cheat, and again, just lift up the lack of any movement right now when we're thinking about childcare and paid leave. It would be really necessary, not just great, but necessary to see something move there.
I can go next. Yeah, I'll be watching several of the proposals that aim to put more teachers in the classroom in the shorter term. There are several proposals several investments from 2021-22 that created additional pathways to get more educators across different schools. But I'm curious to see what changes happen to those proposals to try to get more teachers in the classroom now, given that there's shortages in substitute teachers, credentialed teachers. So definitely looking forward to see what changes happen in that area.
I think Audio and I are having a stare down. I can go next. I would say paying close attention to a lot of the homelessness funding, right? We know obviously it is significant funding, but it is a major issue. And everyone who does experience homelessness is for a variety of complex reasons that can't be fixed with a lot of one-time funding. And I think we know that, and we have the evidence and we have the solutions. So seeing where that goes. And also another plug for the GAN limit and see how that ends up later on. So.
You all had a chance to go, right? Audio, you went first, right?
Yeah. Oh, so, my bad. Sorry.
No, it's all right. So, and if I could put in a plug, Monica, thank you for bringing up the GAN limit again, because I think several of us here are very interested to see what is actually going to happen with the GAN limit this year. How big of a problem is it going to be? And what kinds of solutions are going to be proposed? And are those solutions going to be as equitable as possible, given the constraints of this spending cap imposed on us by a prior generation? So with that, I'm afraid to say that we have reached the end of our time together. Thank you to my colleagues, Audio, Eric, Essie, and Monica for addressing these pressing questions today. And to our audience, I hope this event has helped you to better understand the governor's proposals and what they might mean for California as we head into some very busy months. For more details on the various proposals, check out our first look analysis on our website. We couldn't answer every question because of time constraints, but feel free to reach out to any of us at the Budget Center with your questions in the weeks and months ahead. We really are here to help. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on this first Empower event of 2022 and how we can make these events more helpful to you. So please take a moment to fill out the survey that we will be sending out to you soon. Of course, I can't end this event without giving a really big shout out to the entire Budget Center team, including the analysts, advancement, and communications teams, for helping to make both our first look publication and this event possible. Finally, I'll say that we truly hope that you leave us today with a better understanding of where things stand on the budget, key action steps to keep in mind, and of course, feeling a little bit more empowered. Thank you.